Everything started when Arlo Whitaker, a 40-year-old man with a tired gaze and a touch of gray in his hair, returned to his hometown of Glenhaven for the first time in 20 years. The town had changed. Familiar stores with peeling signs now stood empty, and the once perfectly smooth roads were covered with cracks and weeds. The only thing that remained unchanged was the sluggish, almost thick fog-like sense of time that slowed down as soon as you stepped onto the main street. There was no rush here, but no liveliness either. Arlo had returned to sell his grandmother's old house, but Glenhaven, it turned out, was not going to let him go so easily. "Do you remember the old house on Black Ridge Road?" Cassida Tane, his childhood friend, suddenly asked when they met at the local diner. Cassida hadn't changed. The same blonde hair, the same sparkling eyes, though now they held a weariness familiar to anyone who had spent their entire life in this town. "Have you ever been there since that incident?" Arlo gave her a long look, a mix of curiosity and caution. "No," he replied. "Did you happen to remember it?" Cassida shrugged, but there was a tension in her movement. "I just heard someone saw lights in the windows again. You know these stories. The town lives on them." Joel Bridges, sitting across from them, snorted and leaned back in his chair. His massive frame took up more space than the cramped booth allowed. He had always been a skeptic. "Come on, Cass," he said. "There's no one there. Those houses are just dead boxes." "That's what you think," she retorted, her voice rising slightly. "But there's something there, and you know it." The conversation stopped. Cassida looked at Arlo, her gaze challenging, as if she demanded proof from him that he still believed in something more than what his mind could see. Or maybe she just wanted him to be the one to solve the mystery the town had carried all these years. An hour later, they stood at the edge of an overgrown field that had once been a clean, well-kept meadow. Now the grass reached their knees, clinging to their shoes, and the place looked as if it had been forgotten by time itself. In the distance, the house was visible. It looked even worse than in Arlo's memories. The once white walls were now peeling, and ivy, as if alive, crawled up the cracked facade. "Well, there it is," Joel said, crossing his arms. "Do you really want to go in there?" Cassida answered for all of them. "We're not just going in. We're going to find out what's hidden behind those walls." They began to move through the thick grass. Each step seemed loud against the backdrop of silence, broken only by the distant cries of birds. As they approached, Arlo noticed that the windows were not just broken. Dark holes gaped inside them, as if the house was watching them with empty eye sockets. The old door, partially hidden by ivy, hung on one hinge, and it seemed that any movement could tear it off. "Creepy," Joel muttered, but he didn't move. Arlo stepped forward first. Beneath his feet, the wood creaked, and he froze, listening. Nothing. No sound. Only his own breath and the faint heartbeat echoing in his ears. The house seemed to draw them in, like a spider luring prey into its web. Inside, the air was heavy, filled with the scent of dampness and something more ancient, almost otherworldly. In the corner lay old furniture, covered with a thick layer of dust. The wallpaper peeled off the walls, revealing dark wooden boards, marked with strange indentations. Arlo touched one of them with his fingers. The depressions resembled symbols, but he couldn't read them. "Look," Cassida called out. Her voice came from somewhere in the shadows. They approached her and froze. On the floor, amidst the debris and rubble, lay an old, tattered book. The leather binding was cracked, and on the cover were the words, "Let their secrets remain here." Arlo felt his fingers tremble as he picked up the book. It was cold to the touch, like ice. Inside, on the first page, someone had written in a messy hand, "Do not open the door if you want to leave." The journey back to town was silent. None of the three dared to speak, as if every word could awaken something that had been dormant in that house until now. Arlo held the book tightly, feeling its coldness through the fabric of the backpack he had hidden it in. Even through the fabric, that cold penetrated straight to the heart, causing an unpleasant feeling of emptiness. "What are we going to do with this?" Cassida finally asked, breaking the tense silence. Joel shrugged, but his face looked grim. "Throw it away, burn it, bury it, anything, just to forget we ever went there." But Arlo didn't respond. In his head, the words from the diary echoed, Do not open the door if you want to leave. Which door? Why can't it be opened? These questions, like a thorn, stuck in his consciousness. They decided to gather at Cassida's house in the evening to reread the found notes. Each of them understood that ignoring this would be foolish. Arlo felt that the book wanted something from him, and this thought scared him more than the house itself. Evening. Cassida's house was quiet, the silence broken only by the sound of an old record player creaking somewhere in the corner. The book lay on the table, its tattered appearance seeming ominous. Joel sat on the couch, leaning back and watching everything with a mix of irritation and fear. "All right, come on," he exhaled. "Open it. Read and forget." Arlo carefully opened the book, and the pages, it seemed, rustled like a whisper. On each page were notes, diagrams, strange drawings. Many words were crossed out or smudged. But from what they could make out, one thing became clear. The house was not an ordinary place. It was sealed like a prison. Something inside was trying to be contained. This is nonsense," Joel muttered, but there was no conviction in his voice. Cassida, on the other hand, was silent. Her gaze was fixed on the page where a silhouette of a tall figure with scratched-out eyes was depicted. Under the drawing was one word: keeper. The night was deep, and Cassida's house was filled with oppressive silence. After reading the book, each of them was lost in their thoughts. It seemed that even the walls of the house were permeated with tension, as if an invisible burden weighed on each of them. Arlo couldn't shake the feeling that the book couldn't just be left alone. It seemed to demand attention. "Why is this keeper mentioned so often?" Cassida wondered aloud, breaking the silence. Her voice was almost a whisper, as if she was afraid someone else might hear. "All these symbols, drawings, notes, why are they so important?" Joel got up from the couch and began nervously pacing the room. "You want to know why? Because this stuff is dangerous, that's why. We shouldn't have gone there, shouldn't have taken this book. We should have just left everything as it was." "Leave everything as it was," Arlo echoed, his voice unexpectedly firm. He looked sharply at Joel. "Don't you feel that this is more than just a story? This house, this book, even these words. It's all connected. We can't just forget." Cassida watched both of them, her gaze darting between them. She felt the tension between her friends growing, as if their fears and doubts were turning into a tangible barrier. Suddenly, all three of them jumped. In the room there was a strange sound, soft but deep, like the moan of wind passing through a narrow pipe. They froze, each feeling the chill run down their spines. What was that?" Cassida's voice trembled. She looked at the window, but outside was only thick darkness. "Probably a draft," Joel said uncertainly, but he couldn't make himself sit down again. Instead, he approached the window, looking out. Meanwhile, Arlo moved closer to the book. His fingers carefully flipped through several pages until he stopped at a drawing that made him freeze. It was a plan of the house, but in the center was a hidden passage leading from the basement to some underground room. Next to this place was a note: "Here sleeps the key." "We have to go back," Arlo said firmly, showing the drawing to the others. "This means something. It might explain what we found." Cassida hesitated, but her gaze was filled with determination. Joel, on the other hand, looked troubled. "You're crazy," he muttered. "You want to get even deeper into this?" "Yes, I do. Because if we don't find out what this is, who knows what it could lead to?" Arlo replied sharply. His voice was firm, though his chest tightened with fear. And so they made their decision. The night was not over, and the path back to the house on Black Ridge Road had only just begun. The return to the house on Black Ridge Road was surprisingly quick. The night enveloped everything in thick darkness, and their flashlights barely pierced the gloom. It seemed that even the wind avoided this place, creating an impenetrable silence around it. Joel nervously looked over his shoulder, clearly regretting his involvement. "If we get in trouble—" "I warned you," he muttered, but no one responded. They were already too close to the house to turn back. The door hung just as crookedly as before, but now it seemed to look at them with silent reproach. Arlo stepped inside first, and the sound of his footsteps echoed through the empty space. Underfoot, the wood creaked, and he froze, listening. Nothing. No sound. Only his own breathing and the faint heartbeat echoing in his ears. The house seemed to be drawing them in, like a spider luring its prey into a web. "This way," Arlo said softly, holding the plan he had found in the book in front of him. They descended into the basement, which looked even more sinister than during their first visit. The shadows cast by their flashlights danced on the walls, creating the illusion of moving figures. Arlo's heart pounded so loudly that he was sure the others could hear it. "Here," Cassida whispered, pointing to the wall marked on the plan. It was a stone barrier with a barely noticeable crack along the edge. She ran her fingers over the rough surface until she found a hidden panel. Click. The stone slab slowly moved aside, revealing a dark passage from which a chill and dampness emanated. "Who's first?" Joel tried to joke, but his voice sounded strained. Arlo stepped forward, followed by Cassida. The passage led to a narrow corridor, lit only by their flashlights. The air was filled with a barely perceptible scent of decay. At the end of the corridor, they saw a door, massive, metallic, with an engraved symbol resembling a star. Arlo cautiously placed his hand on its cold surface, and at that moment, his flashlight flickered. He turned to make sure the others were still nearby. "This is it," he said softly. Inside him, everything screamed that the door should not be opened, but something stronger than fear pulled him forward. "What are we going to do?" Cassida whispered, her voice trembling. "Open it," Arlo replied firmly. His fingers found a massive lever on the door, and he slowly pulled it. The door creaked open, revealing a black void before them. But in that darkness, something moved. Something that seemed to have been waiting for them for a very long time. The thick darkness behind the door seemed to have a life of its own. It did not dissipate under the light of the flashlights, but seemed to absorb it, pulling the beams into its depths. Arlo stepped forward, feeling the cold penetrate his clothes. His breath came out in clouds of steam, despite the basement never being this cold. "I don't like this," Joel muttered, but he followed the others. His voice sounded weak and trembling. The corridor behind the door turned out to be wider than they expected. Its walls were covered with strange symbols, similar to those Arlo had noticed in the house. On the floor were deep scratches, as if someone or something had dragged heavy objects here. "Look," Cassida pointed to the wall, where one of the symbols was outlined in red paint. Beneath it were fresh tracks. Something or someone had been here recently. Suddenly, their flashlights flickered. Arlo felt his heart skip a beat as a low, rhythmic sound echoed behind them, like heavy footsteps. "What the?" Joel spun around, aiming his flashlight into the darkness. But the beam revealed nothing. Cassida grabbed Arlo's hand. "We're not alone." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Something is following us." They continued moving forward, trying not to look back. The corridor led them into a large room with a high ceiling that disappeared into the shadows. In the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, covered with symbols that glowed with a faint reddish light. The air was filled with the scent of burning and metal. On the altar lay a small chest, bound with iron. Arlo stepped toward it, but Cassida grabbed his arm. "Don't," she said. "It could be a trap. If we don't open it, we'll never know what it is." Arlo replied firmly. He pulled on the lid of the chest and it creaked open loudly. Inside lay a key, carved from black stone, and a small note with a single phrase, "You have released them." Before any of them could say anything, the room filled with a hum. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and the air became heavy, as if the oxygen was being sucked out. In the distance, a sound could be heard, deep, low, rumbling, filling their minds with fear. "We have to go!" Cassida screamed, grabbing Joel's hand. But the way back had already disappeared. The corridor they had come through was swallowed by darkness, from which silhouettes began to emerge, tall, distorted figures with burning eyes. Arlo gripped the key tighter. Now they had no choice but to move forward. The only question was where this path would lead them. The darkness surrounding them left no chance of return. Each step forward felt like a desperate attempt to escape the trap. But deep down, they knew there might be no way out. The strange silhouettes they had seen remained in the distance, but their presence was almost tangible. They did not pursue but watched, each of their steps echoing loudly. The altar was left behind, but the sense of its power still hung in the air. The stone key Arlo held felt incredibly heavy and strangely light at the same time. He knew this key would open something, but the question, what exactly, continued to haunt him. "We have to keep moving," Cassida whispered. Her voice trembled, but her eyes shone with determination. Joel looked like he was ready to turn and run, but their surroundings remained unchanged. The darkness enveloped them in a circle, not allowing them to leave. They moved on. Soon their flashlights illuminated a massive arch covered in carved symbols. In the center of the arch was a circular stone, perfectly fitting the shape of the key. "This is it," Arlo said softly, stepping forward. "Don't do it," Joel's voice was filled with panic. "We don't know what will happen next." Arlo turned to him. "We have no other choice. If we stay here, this darkness will consume us." The key slid into the slot with a soft click. The symbols on the arch began to glow, and the air around them filled with vibrations. At first nothing happened, but then a loud rumble echoed. The darkness began to recede, revealing a huge empty room before them. In its center stood a figure, tall, menacing, with burning eyes. "You have released me," the creature's voice echoed in their minds, like the whisper of many voices. "I have waited for centuries." Cassida grabbed Arlo's arm, her gaze darting between the creature and the door they had come through. "What have we done?" she whispered. The creature moved toward them, its steps making no sound, but each step made the walls vibrate. At that moment, the stone key in Arlo's hand began to glow. He realized that the key was not just a tool, but also a weapon. "Run!" Arlo shouted, pushing Cassida and Joel toward the exit. "I'll hold it off." "No!" Cassida tried to grab him, but Joel pulled her back. The creature approached Arlo, but he raised the key. The light emanating from it became unbearably bright, and the creature stopped. "You cannot defeat me, mortal," it said, but there was a note of doubt in its voice. "Maybe," Arlo replied, gripping the key tighter, "but I can hold you back." The last thing Cassida and Joel saw as they fled through the archway was a bright burst of light. When they emerged on the surface, the house collapsed behind them, leaving only a cloud of dust. Later, standing at the edge of the ruined field, Cassida looked at Joel. "We have to tell people about what happened." Joel shook his head. "Who would believe us?" Cassida looked into the distance where the house had once stood. "Maybe it doesn't matter. The important thing is that it stays here." The darkness no longer seemed threatening, but in its heart remained a secret that would never be fully revealed.